Okay, okay. So meeting is not officially called to order, but I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and the land. I'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded land of the Dena'ina people and thank them for their past, present, and future stewardship of the land on which we live. Also, our Teams chat notes, I don't know if this has the same meaning if we're not called into effect, but when we are officially in session, note that the Teams chat is not part of the audio recording of the meeting. So to make the audio record as complete as possible, please state your comment into the record if you can. So with that, I think we can probably begin with, I guess we don't do a roll call yet or anything like that. But we can probably just jump into doing some informational reports. I think that we might need to reshuffle the order of the reports a little bit because Austin Quinn Davidson said she would be able to call in, I think, closer to 12. But I do not have a report as chair. But maybe we can start with the either the school district or the OMB reports. Any preference?
I don't.
Oh, we can. I don't know a whole lot, but
we can just
go ahead.
Put the assembly towards the bottom.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Maybe school district first, just that way if you
Yeah.
can stay the whole time. Because I imagine the revised budget, I mean, I'm just curious. Kind of
Yeah, let's go ahead and do school district.
All right, I don't have a whole lot for you, just mentioned the budget passed through the assembly, that second meeting in March, so thank you all for that. And I guess we're working on the munis put out the tax notices to include all that, so that's good. The other things kind of going on in the school district are school start times. I don't know if you've seen a survey about that, but it's really going to, it's not necessarily a budget line item, but it's a proposal to, right now we start high schools at 7:30, middle schools at 8:15, and then elementary at 9. We've engaged with some like sleep experts and other folks to have different opinions on who should be getting up like the latest, I guess, for the best instruction. So we had town halls, we have surveys out, district's going to come back, or the administration will come back with a proposal to change those start times and have the board potentially approve that. We did try this a few years ago and it didn't pass, but they're taking another run at it. The science says that elementary schools, those students do better because they're up earlier, just their natural sleep rhythms are more geared towards elementary schools than it is for high schools. And the school districts that have implemented this change where high schools are starting the latest have seen increase in student performance and safety issues across the board with their experience. So that's one of the big things that's going on. We also have some proposals out there for professional learning communities, or PLCs as they call them. And that would be essentially a late start on, I think it's proposed as like Mondays right now. All our high schools do it. They have like an hour late start on Mondays, and it's a chance for the teachers to have professional development during that time without interfering with their bargain planning time. So that's another one we have coming due, and we want to do it district-wide. That way it'll adjust with our bus schedule, so every school's on the same, starts an hour later all across levels. So right now it's just the high schools, so those kids that are getting dropped off by the bus don't have anything to do for an hour. They're still getting up early and just hanging out until that hour's done, essentially. So our proposal would be to do it all levels, so you can keep staggering the buses. We run the 3 tiers of busing. So that's the other thing we going on. Gearing up for graduation. It's coming up pretty soon, so if you have any seniors, you're probably tracking that. The other thing I'd say with the school start times, there is some efficiencies to gain there with the busing with regard to activities and sports. Because right now we need, we start high schools and then the bus, by the time they need to go do their sports, we're still running buses for middle and elementary schools. So having that at high schools at the end or towards the end of the schedule would allow those extra buses to be able to be used to take them to practice or wherever they're going, track meets, whatever it is. Aside from that, really, that's the biggest things going on in the district. And then we're just tracking the legislation. There are a couple different, there's Senate bill, I believe it's 52 out there to increase the base student allocation by $1,000 for FY '24, then another 300 and change in FY '25, and then inflation proofed after that. So we really support that bill. Hopefully that will go through. And there was some other House legislation where they had passed, I think, $175 million one-time funding within their normal budgeting process, and then pulled that back and put it contingent upon a CBR draw. So still working with those and just helping out the legislature wherever we can and advocating for our students. Questions?
Yeah, I had a hard time kind of understanding what exactly was like the strategy behind the CBR draw in the House, tying the funding to the CBR draw. Do you know anything about why that was?
No, I mean, my inclination would be that it was because you had to get a 2/3 majority to get it out of the CBR versus, 50%. That's just the normal budgeting process, that it would be able to tie more items to gain more broad support for those people that support the education or want that education funding to get out. There might be other things included in that CBR draw that they would need to support to get their education money. That's my inclination on it, but frankly, I don't know for sure that that's what they were thinking.
Sure. Other questions for Andy?
I had one, I guess. And I know maybe you could just provide it as a follow-up, but I was curious, what is the enrollment trend? Because I know the enrollment was down basically during COVID, because, pull the kids out of school or whatever, and then it's gone back up a little bit, but what are you guys kind of projecting for the next few years?
So next year, we're projecting it to go up a little bit. Again, I think a few hundred students is what we have budgeted. And then after that, we expect it to start kind of tapering back off again, where we see that net out migration and just kind of aging population.
And is that increase mostly like new, like kindergartners coming in, or is it across the board?
It's been across the board with folks coming back from either statewide correspondence schools or private schools or something. We saw a lot of them come back from, I think, private schools, because there's a lot of families that put their kids in those just because they were still doing in-person learning. They just couldn't stay home. They had to work. So a lot of families that did that are coming back to public schools. But yeah, it's been hard to predict the last few years.
Sure.
And we will have an increase in our ADM, or we're trying to have an increase in our ADM for the Alaska Reads Act, provided a half ADM for pre-K students that are not tied to either special education funding or other federal funding like Title I or Migrant Ed. So we're hoping to stand up some new preschool programs with that money in addition to what we use in the alcohol tax for those pre-Ks. So still beyond me why we don't have a universal pre-K system in the state, but do the best we can to try to piece as many pre-K classes as we can.
Yeah, Carol.
What's the ADM?
Average daily membership. So it's the count we take every October. It's over like 20 days, and it's pretty close to enrollment, but it'll always be less than enrollment because we take, the high school students that we take in 3 classes, they're going to be counted as half-time. So it just makes them fractional for the time that the contact time that we have with each student.
So the Alaska Reads Act has provisions to it that are not funded, that has some unfunded elements to it, I think, if I've understood correctly.
I believe so. We haven't really delved into what exactly that's going to cost, but they have like reading experts, and I think that they're going to be required. There's some things like we got a grant, I think it was $3.8 million for the K-3 English language arts curriculum. So we're in the process of purchasing that, but however, we're going to have an added cost for it doesn't cover professional development, so we need to bring our teachers back a few days early to do that training to get them kind of spun up on this new curriculum and how to teach it. So there are going to be costs like that. I believe there's some other provisions that we're still just kind of going through and seeing what those added costs might be.
Anything else for Andy? Right, thanks. Yeah, we were supposed to discuss a resolution on the BSA as well later in our meeting too. So So yeah, so I don't know if you can stay for that, Andy, or not. But, okay. Then, moving on, then, you report.
Yes, so the 2023, I'll update on the revised budget. That's really what we're working on. Our finance department is still working on closing our 2022 financials, and so the ending amounts are unknown at this time. Our CFO has presented to the audit committee and I believe to the public finance or the budget and finance committee as well. Right now, I think the fund balance projection is a negative $55 million, if I remember correctly. So, but as those books close and everything gets reconciled, those figures will be updated. But right now, that's what we're looking at, which again, the majority is a reflection of the FEMA reimbursement or lack thereof, and the lack of obligation from FEMA in those COVID responses through June 30th of 2022 is when we ended all of that activity. So that is where we are with those. But for the revised budget, all of the documents can be found on the muni.org website under departments and then management and budget. They can also be found on the agenda. They were introduced at the meeting last night. So these document numbers are on that agenda, and the documents are available as well under the Assembly's meetings page. And so the general government operating budget as introduced just reflects the majority of the changes are either contractual obligations or unforeseen items that came up since the approval. There's no programmatic changes that are included in this. So it's just really what we would say is a continuation budget as well. Again, these documents are a little lengthy, but it has a lot of good detail. But the line item changes are in what we call the AM support. And that is a spreadsheet that is attached to this document, and it shows all of the line item changes from the revised budget. And I'll just go through some high level on that because there are some details, but I am doing my presentation to the assembly tomorrow at 11 a.m. And again, that's a public meeting, so if anybody wants to tune into that, you'll get the full details of those changes. And we can put the recording of that on the Budget Advisory Commission page so that it can be referenced as well when that's over. So from this spreadsheet, just some very high changes. We start with the changes in our funding sources because really that kind of determines what we have available for expenses, what do we have for funding. And what we've seen in our non-property tax revenues was an increase of $5.4 million. And what that is an increase to our tax anticipation notes. So, we go out and we use a government funding mechanism to make sure we have enough cash on hand for us to pay our bills until we receive property tax revenues. But as part of that, it's a borrowing program, which means that it costs us to be able to use that mechanism. So as part of that is we get that revenue in, but it also costs us money. And so what we've seen with the increase in the rates from last year and the increases this year is that in order to use that program, it's actually going to cost us $1.5 million. So in this, that's actually this line right here, and I can't change this, I don't think. Oh, maybe I can. Let's see, go all the way. There we go. So that's actually this line here, line 12, and that's what our tax anticipation notes are. And so what you notice is that there is a change in the revenue, but it also comes with an increased cost, which means that it increases the need for property taxes just to utilize that program. One of the other changes, large changes in our revenue sources is room tax. So the expectation is based on last year's activity from Treasury is that we have an increased amount of room tax. But the way that the room tax is set out in code is that we actually have an obligation to split that room tax to pay the civic ventures, but also pay Visit Anchorage. And so what you notice is that although we're seeing a $2.2 million increase in those revenues, we actually have a $500,000 increase in our expense in order to do that. And then this is the payment out. So this is actually not revenue affecting the property taxes. So really of the $2.2 million that we're gonna see in that increase, only 200,000 of that gave us property tax relief. So those are a couple of the big impacts to the revenue sources. The other big impact is what we call the SEMT, and that's the Supplemental Emergency Medical Transportation Program that the federal government implemented, I believe it was in 2018. We worked with the state over the last few years to get those regulations in place and the statutes created so that we could start receiving this revenue source. So through the 2023 approved process, we programmed in our annual expectation of those revenues. But what we did is worked with the fire department on how much they recently submitted and what we expect to get back in revenues for 2023. And what we show is that we're going to get another $2.5 million out of that program. So I believe there's a total of $13 million right now programmed for revenues of the SEMT program. And so that is a direct offset of the need for property taxes. So if we come back down a little bit lower here, and I believe it is this community assistance program. So this is line 19. This is what we call the revenue sharing from the state. Again, over the last, years, I would say 5 to 6 years, they slowly have been whittling down that revenue sharing number. It fluctuates from year to year, but really what they have programmed in without any special appropriations is $400,000. And so based on that, we did receive notification from DCCED at the state level, and they said as the only information that they have is that we're going to be allocated that $400,000. And so we are bringing our revenue sources down to that amount. We had $1.7 million programmed in there. And so that is a need. So again, the non-property tax revenue goes down. That means that we need property taxes to cover that. So what this tells us is that of the $5.4 million of property or of non-property tax revenue that we're getting, it only offsets property taxes by $1.4 million. And then when we come down here to this section, this is what we call the tax cap implications. And this is the property taxes under the tax cap. And so right now, the marijuana tax coming out of the tax cap is not factored in this because it has an implementation of 2024, but property taxpayers will see that when we do next year's budget, and that will affect to the tune of, right now we have $5.7 million. So what you would see in this line is that it's going to be a reduction of $5.7 million in this line and a need of property taxes. So when that comes in 2024, we will see that, but we're not accounting for it now because it is something that takes effect in 2024 and not for 2023. What we do see is that for the other taxes that are inside the tax cap, those revenues are going down by $1.5 million. And so it ups the need for property taxes by $1.5 million. And so what you'll notice is that based on those items inside the tax cap, so our debt for bonds went up significantly to almost $6 million. And so that is a direct increase to property taxes to cover that debt. And so although we've seen we've seen this reduction here to property taxes for 1.4 million based on our revenues. The fact that we have these taxes going down plus the cost of our debt going up relied on $8.7 million in property tax needs. And so this is actually what the increase is in this budget for property taxes. The next section is the changes to the departments. And again, these are just mostly programmed CPI increases. There is a line in here where we are adding $1 million for snow removal and maintenance and operations. So I think everybody knows that we had to remove a little bit of more snow this spring than we wanted to. So they used up all of their money that they had in their budget. Normally that would cover them for an entire year. They're going to need funding from the October to December piece. And that's what this is. So ins and outs of all the departments, again, not any significant changes anywhere. In total, the changes are $250,000. So when you take the total of this section, and then the changes in our revenues, that is what gets you our total change in property taxes, which is $7.5 million. And again, the majority of that is just based on the changes of our revenues, and that's with the debt service, the room tax, and all of the taxes under the cap that are changing. So that's just a high overview of what's being submitted. This last section, this is all of the limited road service areas, the rural road service areas that have boards that determine what their budgets are. These are the groups of people that have voted to tax themselves into the small service areas. And so that's why that isn't calculated in there, because they are in their separate service areas. They are not in what we would consider the 5 majors. So that's just a high overview of the general government budget. The thing that I want to talk about a little bit more is this mill rate. So we submitted the mill rates based on the information that we had, and obviously that was last week. So what we see now is that the property tax exemption has been approved. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be working with the assessor's office in the next week or so, and determining how that's going to affect these mill rates. And what we know is it's going to affect it pretty substantially. So the voters approved to increase the exemption for property for assessed values. And what that does is takes the overall assessed values that are applied within each service area and lowers that amount, which means that the budget's not changing, but the assessed values is going to go down, and that's the calculation that determines the mill rate. And so what that's going to do is it's going to take the current budget divided by a smaller assessed value gets you a higher mill rate. And so we will be submitting some pretty substantial S versions by the 25th that are going to show increases in these mill rates. And that's because of the direct reflection of the lower assessed values. So what we're getting preliminarily from the assessor is that there will be a $1.25 billion decrease to the overall assessed values. That is substantial. So what you're going to see is these mill rates are going to be larger that are going to set property taxes. And the reason I'm saying that is because of the process that happens with first quarter, this today and tomorrow, when we talk to the Budget and Finance Committee, are the only times we have to talk about this. And then the documents will show up on the 25th. And so we want to make sure that everybody is aware that based on these propositions that are passed, these are the implications that are coming along. So these limited road service areas and stuff, their mills aren't going to change because they've said this is all they're willing to tax themselves. But what will happen is we will have to adjust their budgets in order to comply with that mill rate. So a lot of them are going to see a decrease in the available budget to them because the assessed values were reduced. And then in these areas in the 5 majors where there's no maximum mill rate, what you're going to see is an increased mill rate. So although people may have a change in their exemption, it is going to be a higher mill rate applied to your assessed values now.
Does that shift taxes over to like, because the exemptions were personal property, right? Does that shift more of the burden over to business or like property?
Yeah, so basically it shifts the burden to anybody who's not receiving the exemptions. So if you're, residential and the exemptions don't apply to you, or you're not getting the full exemption or any one of those, scenarios, or commercial, this does, so it doesn't change the need, and it doesn't change, how much is going to be applied. It just changes who pays it. And so that really does. And for some people, they might not see the reduction they thought they were going to with the increased exemption because the reduction in the assessed values is so significant. That's really going to change these mill rates. So, but it is a direct reflection of the proposition that passed. We will account for the other propositions that have passed. So there was some annexations in some of the smaller service areas and things. So we will account for those as well. And so that just the shifting of all of that. But those will be S versions because, again, this was submitted last week and now we live in this week. So we will submit S versions to accommodate all of the propositions that now impact these documents. Anna?
I have a bunch of questions, but I'll start with a couple too.
Yeah.
Well, I guess so, and a comment too, I think the other group of property owners that will see an increase is like non-owner occupied residential properties, which could be like short-term rentals and long-term rentals, I think. Is that right? Because if you're not owner occupied, but you have a residential, like a house or a duplex or something.
I rely on the assessor's office
Yeah.
to tell us all of those things. So all I know is that anyone who's not getting the exemption, it pushes, again, the need doesn't change. And so it just pushes the cost out. So
Right.
it's just the mix of how that happens.
That's a really good point though, because like multifamily doesn't get a residential exemption.
I would have to ask Jack on that. I
Probably
don't
not
know.
unless they live in
I
the.
mean, yeah. Or something equivalent to it, huh? Yeah. Interesting.
So I have the question, so the service areas you were saying, they basically
Yep.
set their maximum mill rate, and then do they have, like, so if they don't want to see a reduction in their budget, for example, can they go back and set that again, or is it?
No, so the mill rates are a required voter approval.
Oh, I see.
And so if next year they wanted to, if they said, okay, well, with the reduced assessed values, it's not giving us enough budget to be able to accommodate what we need to do or want to do, they could go back to their service area, put it on the ballot for next year.
Okay.
But for this year, they don't have the opportunity to do that because they don't have the voter approval to do that.
Okay.
And so their budget will calculate out to whatever this requires based on the assessed values in their area.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And then my other question was, because I know there's it's basically the mill rate and then the assessed value, and those are the two factors that affect what our property taxes ended up, well, plus all the exemptions and other things.
It's the property tax need divided by the assessed values that sets the mill rate.
Okay.
And so that is how that calculation comes out. And so that's why when you reduce the assessed values by substantially, that's your denominator. Now that creates your higher mill rate. And that's why you're going to see these mill rates go up, is because you're taking such a significant piece outside of that.
Okay.
Yep.
And then, so it sounds like too, that if I remember correctly, for different reasons, the reverse was true last year, right? Where the mill rate actually did go down slightly, but it was partly because assessed values were so much higher. Is that right? Because I know assessed values in general have been going
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, and it's, that's how it's set every year.
Yeah.
You know, so you take your tax need and then you take your assessed values and then that gets you your mill rate. And so if your tax need goes up and your assessed values go up at the same rate, then your mill rate would stay the same, you know, there'd be no change. But if you had and that's, you know, how this is coming in is that if your need goes up, but your assessed values don't, then that's how you now have an increased mill rate.
And this is the first year that the assessed values have gone down in a while. Right? 'Cause last year, I think they were up.
I think that assessed values have been going up for quite a while.
Yeah.
I don't remember,
It stayed fairly flat, and last year they went up like 8% or something. So we saw that as part of that required local contribution, why our portion of the taxes are going up so much.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, right, that first.
Is that all yours?
Oh, I guess while we're on that subject too, I was wondering, so taking the marijuana tax out of the, under the cap.
Yep.
Like, and I know that was what was it Prop 14 did. And then you said it's about 5 million total.
yeah, it'll be, right now it's 5.7 in this budget. Next year, you know, that is what will come out in totality.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one is a comment. So I saw at the legislative level, they're proposing a reduction in the state tax, the excise tax. So it's right now it's $50 an ounce, so it could go down. I know there's been a lot of discussion about changing the tax structure. So it also means the price would go down. And so anyway, that's just an aside that, that if the retail price goes down, then our sales tax revenue would go down slightly.
And what that would mean is that once that comes out of the tax and is designated for that specific purpose, so what we would do is it's gonna come out of the cap and then it becomes kind of like the alcohol tax, where now it's designated in its own bucket with its own purpose and it'll have its own board. And so that board will have to stick within whatever that budget is set at. And so if that is what comes to fruition and, you know, it's seeing a reduction, then that program is only going to see the revenue source of whatever comes in. So
Unless a lot more people start consuming, I guess, but.
Yeah. I guess that's the other, that's the other side of it.
Not,
so.
not pushing that. But,
Yeah.
The other question though was, do you have a rough guess of what that means per household? Because I know it's a, you know, let's say almost 6 million total. Is it like a few cents reduction? Is it a few dollars reduction or
For,
sorry, for a household, if it's, you know, 6 million total,
for the S version,
yeah,
I don't have that yet, but I will have it for tomorrow's meeting.
okay.
So I will be able to say, because this is something that, so again, I didn't want to gloss over the changes, but really the majority of them are based on the revenue changes and then the requirement of debt and those items. And so it wasn't a gloss over of the changes, but the majority of it, you know, is a requirement more than anything else. And so this is really the big topic, because again, this is what everyone is seeing right now, but this is not what will happen. And so we want to make sure that everybody realizes what that means by the time we get to, you know, 2 weeks from now, so that it's not a surprise of like, this was a negative number for area wide, and then it turns into a positive number.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and so we want to, so a lot of, and probably not even a lot, but it'll be the same conversation tomorrow where it's like, okay, here's the budget stuff, but here's, you know, what's coming. So we have that. So I don't have it right now, but I will have it for tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, because that's what I'd be curious, just like what is the impact to the average household or, you know, per 100,000 or whatever it is.
Yep. And that's exactly what we're aiming for, is to be able to kind of message that so that people understand, like, okay, like this was what voters, you know, wanted, but this is the impact of that.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I have one more other question. Sorry. So just to understand, because you mentioned it sounded like basically a line of credit, right? Like a company would have, so that they can make sure they make payroll if they have any interruptions in there. This is separate from
The tax anticipation notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically the government form of that.
Yeah.
Is that we have this ability, and that's why it's called the tax anticipation notes. is because governments are the only people that are allowed to go do this in anticipation of taxes.
Okay.
And so it's just a program to make sure that you have cash on hand to be able to pay your bills, pay your payroll, all of those things and transact until basically in anticipation of taxes.
Yeah.
And then we get our taxes back and then we pay back, the money that we owe for that. But because of the rising interest rates and everything else, we're seeing an increased cost in order to utilize that program.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna ask, is it's same with the increase in the bond, the cost of the bonds, is that mostly just the kind of global issue of interest rate increase, or does it have to do, because I know there's been some changes to our bond rating as well. I was just curious on both of those things.
I would have to look into that on what the details are. And so what public finance does is they have a debt schedule. And so it's all based on, what we have outstanding at that point, what new issuances we might have, and then if they've gone and refinanced any, recently.
Okay.
And so I can ask them what built up that change, if it was just, the new issuances that came in, or if for some reason we had, because again, we're talking 20-year bonds, so I don't know at what points these are, we are, that some of them are hitting now, then maybe some of them weren't.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, thanks.
yep.
And then also, I can't see Teams, but I don't know if Rachel had any questions. So if she had her hand up, I wouldn't see that. Looks like she doesn't. DC Austin is on, but let's see, but I think Carolyn also had questions. So,
Yeah, I'm good as far as.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to the mill rate going up so significantly.
Yep.
And that means that tax burdens are going to be shifted, property tax burdens are going to be shifted to other entities like commercial real estate. Is it my understanding and following all of that correct?
Yeah, so what it'll do is it'll shift those costs to, again, anybody that's not receiving the residential exemption.
So as far as, I guess, how this might affect like anybody in this room or anybody in the municipality, I imagine we could potentially see increased costs elsewhere. Like, let's say it's a commercial business or something they might do whatever they think they need to do to increase their profit to help cover those taxes that they're now burdened with. Am I following this line of thought correctly?
I mean, potentially. So, each business has, hopefully a business model that they're operating under. But, they set their costs based on, the coverage of their expenses, how much they want to make in a profit. So, I mean, I can't say that they won't, but there could be the potential that some businesses may transfer those costs onto their, users or prices, to be able to cover those instead of eating into what might be their profits.
Right, so there are trickle down effects and like very likely unintended consequences as a result of this voter increase in property tax exemption. Like it's gonna hit us somewhere along the lines throughout life, I imagine,
Potentially.
potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm
Yeah,
not sure how
please.
to get in the queue.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, it's Austin, actually.
Oh, Austin, sorry.
No problem. I assume I just joined, but I assume you're talking about was it 12, the residential tax exemption?
Yes.
So my understanding, Courtney, and we had a work session with the assessor about this back when we were considering putting it on the ballot. There would be impacts to commercial, but there's also quite a bit of shift within, maybe you already talked about this, but within residential taxpayers. So the way we designed it and we picked the amounts, right? We had kind of a range we could work with, both in the amount of the exemption and where the percentage would hit. And we picked a number that basically would mostly benefit people who owned homes in the $100,000 to $300,000 range. So those people would see a much higher benefit based on the formula. And then for folks over or about 900,000 or over, they would pay more. And then kind of right at that boundary, there would be no change. So I don't know how much commercial will it will shift to commercial, but I don't think we should assume, and maybe I missed part of the conversation, but I don't think we should assume that it's all shifting to commercial. And so I don't know, Courtney, if you're able to address that. And if not, Jack, the assessor, could potentially come to the BAC, but I just didn't want folks to go away with the feeling that it was all shifting to commercial.
There is a net shift to commercial though overall, right? Off of residential and onto commercial.
Well, that's the question is, I don't know exactly how much it is, but all I hear Courtney talking about is a shift to commercial, and there's quite a shift within residential from poorer people paying more to wealthier people paying more. So we should, if the purpose of this conversation is to sort that all out, either Courtney should be able to answer that question, or if she can't, which totally makes sense. I shouldn't say should be able to, might be able to. If she can't, we should have Jack answer it before we're disseminating information that people are going to go share in the community.
Right. It's a good point. Thank you. Thank you, Austin.
Courtney, do you know the answer to that?
I don't know. Jack gives us the overall assessed value that gets used for the calculation of the mills. And then as this comes out, it's the mills per service area. So it doesn't necessarily show for commercial or residential.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's something that if you want, I could send an email and CC you guys and ask Jack to describe sort of the impact to both, and then he could write it, potentially get back to us. Or I don't know if you just want to host him. I mean, I kind of want to know the answer too, because other people have been asking this question. I don't think I've had a satisfactory answer of sort of what the percentage of burden on each is.
Is that something that you guys are?
We actually wanted to have Jack come to our next meeting, I think, anyway.
Great.
That could be, because we're going to talk about real property tax.
Okay.
And so that could be a thing that gets clarified in conjunction with that meeting for May.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's definitely something that's relevant to the revised budget discussion, so hopefully that info comes out. But then, yeah, next meeting, maybe, because it would also be after all this is shaken out, all this stuff has been, kind of calculated, so he could run through kind of like, here's how we calculate assessed value, that kind of information, plus here's the implication of these props that passed and
Yeah.
what we're looking at. And, well, not just props, but all the factors that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yep, I made a note to add that. Request them for the next meeting.
Perfect.
And we actually, and to keep things moving along, too, since you're on now, Austin, can we put our assembly report later in our agenda, so to accommodate you. So would you do you want to provide us with the assembly report?
Sure. So I'm not sure what Courtney covered because it might be similar. So just tell me if I'm repeating things. But, we're about, and you all know this too, I think we're about at a time to start working on 1Q. The administration introduced some documents last night, and then we'll vote on the 1Q adjustments on the 25th. Courtney and I will probably have to talk about this at our work session tomorrow. For those of you who are interested in joining, there's a work session from 11 to 12:50 that is Courtney and the admin presenting the 1Q changes and probably any other questions we have just about the overall budget before setting the mill rate tomorrow. So I'm a little confused. I haven't dug into the documents yet, but I'm a little confused because I hear that the administration reflected in their documents that we're at about $3 million below the tax cap right now. And I'm not really sure where that comes from. It's from our calculations based on the budget we approved and any changes we have made since, including something we passed last night that appropriated just over $1 million for public safety things, including an additional AFD academy, training at APD, and additional snow removal. We're just at the cap. We're like $7,000 under or something. So I'm not sure if they have, and Courtney could speak to this now or tomorrow, if they have unspent funds, like funds that we budgeted for, but that they're not actually haven't used, or that there's some reason that they think we're that far below the cap. But it feels like there needs to be a bit of an adjustment probably to to what they presented to us yesterday.
Actually, yeah, I covered a little bit of it just before you got here, Austin, so
Okay.
and we'll go through it tomorrow, but
Okay.
just you want to, so we have, and I'm sure the documents are all familiar to you, but we have the AM support on here where we go through the, revenue changes. And so this is where it shows, the changes to the tax cap. And so from approved, which is where, you guys had your final calculations, I'm sure that you've been working off from. But then as we go through the changes with the treasury, in the revenues and those areas with the tax cap and the changes to the tax cap itself. Because again, when we do the approved budget, we don't have a final CPI number or population number, which are significant factors in the calculation of the tax cap. And so, this document just goes through the changes that impact property taxes. And then we have the final tax cap calculation used in this. So, that calculation changed from when we did the approved budget because we're using the 2022 full year CPI number as part of the 5-year average as well as the population.
Got it. Okay, yeah, and I don't want to, thank you, Courtney, and I don't want to make you repeat if you've already shared that with this crew and they're ahead of me. So maybe you should be giving me the update. No, just kidding. Yeah, that sounds great. We'll talk about it tomorrow, and we'll obviously need to reflect the million or so dollars that we just passed last night, because I don't think that was included in here either, right?
No, and that's kind of, what part of my update too was, we submitted these last week before
Right.
last night. And so, yeah, those are not reflected.
Okay, got it. Great. Yeah, I look forward to that tomorrow. And I don't think I have much else to say because we just talked about the appropriation we did last night as well. So yeah, I don't know, are some of you planning to join for that work session tomorrow? I know it's during the day and you all have other jobs, but you're welcome to be there. I think it'll be interesting.
Yes, thank you, Austin. Carolyn.
I just wanted to express my thanks to Austin for serving in our capacity as an assembly member, and because this is the last Budget Advisory Commission meeting that you're a part of. So thank you for your service, Austin.
Thank you, Carolyn. Likewise, you've done a lot for this city. All of you have. I mean, it's kind of incredible how much volunteer power we have doing essential things to keep everything running. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Austin. Do we have, okay, so then that gets us through all of our informational reports then, I believe. Then are there any member reports on department assignments to share? I don't have any updates. Does anybody else have department assignment updates?
Good.
And Rachel, none from Rachel either. Then I think we can move on to our discussion that we carried over from our last meeting, which is about the ASD or the base student allocation adjustment and potential for a resolution on that. So I think, yeah, in our last meeting, we were kind of preliminary on it. We probably had just really started the discussion about what we wanted to do there. So, I personally am in favor of increasing the BSA and of doing a resolution, to that effect. But I don't know what the will of the whole group is. And also some of the mechanics of, our resolution is typically addressed to the assembly. But I think that the assembly is not necessarily the ones who need to be convinced on the subject. So I open it up to discussion. Anybody, whatever people want to kick off the conversation with. Yeah, Carolyn.
So I'm also in favor of an increase to BSA, but I think the question does become a matter of timing and to whom you write in resolution to. And I'm just not sure exactly how much time we have left to, I guess, have a meaningful impact with any kind of resolution that we come up with, especially since we don't have a quorum today.
Right.
So I just kind of seems like point, but
Yeah, I guess that's my feeling too, that, I personally support it, but it would be challenging to meet the deadline, and then it is I think the BAC, if the task is to generally advise on the city budget, then there is an intersection there, but I also recognize that it is outside of the scope of the meeting itself. Like the issue impacts the meeting, but, it does get a little tricky.
That's true. Although it is part of our mission to also advise the school district on the school district budget specifically too. So there is some impact there. Austin, I see your hand is up.
I think I was going to say just what you said, Nolan, which is it feels external sort of on first blush from our budget, but actually what's happening is that the Muni is having to fill those gaps because the BSA is not going up over time. So I think that whether the BSA is increased or not directly implicates the Muni budget, which you all, the ASD budget, which impacts property tax payers. So I think it's pretty direct connection, but agree that the timing could be tricky.
Well, I think too, I wish there was a way to really, I don't know if obviously the BAC has, or BAC has limited reach to the general public too. But I think it is worth noting, what you shared last meeting, that literally the more that we put into it, the less the state, so it's a zero-sum game. So it's not like we can really, we're already not only contributing the maximum that we can, but the more that we do that, the formula is such that it disincentivizes us from doing that.
Well, that's the required part that you have to. There's no, you don't have an option.
Yeah, well, that's true, but I guess, it still creates this weird.
Right. Where, taxes are continually going up, and we're not seeing any benefit at the district level.
Yeah, so it really speaks to just the flaw in the way that that's even designed, from the city's perspective. Obviously, the state benefits from that situation.
So, I would argue that it is within our wheelhouse, subject to what the whole group thinks when we have quorum, but also that, I know the assembly may not need to be convinced, but I do think that sharing our resolution with all of the Anchorage delegation, House and the Senate, would also be impactful. So there is a bigger audience as well. But that's my 2 cents on it.
Well, I guess realistically too, at least from what we're seeing, it sounds like there's mostly going to be appetite for some kind of 1-year thing and then kick the longer term discussion to next session. Because all of those bills can still be taken up next year. And so I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but realistically, maybe it'd be looking at 2024 or having something in advance of that session if you're going to do anything.
That's certainly a possibility. If those of us here are lukewarm on it, then, we don't necessarily have to act on it as a group. I personally have very strong feelings on it, but that may not be everyone's viewpoint.
Yeah. Well, and I do remember from the last meeting too, a couple members, Carmela, for example, said that it sounded like she was not necessarily in favor of that particular. So I also want to recognize there's diversity of opinion on this group too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Any thoughts from you, Rachel?
No, I'm willing to discuss it.
We could leave it on the agenda as a item for the next meeting if you'd like, or we can move it to topics for another meeting. If you have something you want to take up, maybe in light of the 2024.
We could table it.
Well, maybe by both May certainly by June, maybe by May, depending on when they gavel out this year. It might also be here's a report of what they did and here's the implications for Anchorage for this year. And then that can set up the discussion of what the longer term thing looks like. Because they'll make a decision about it for this year anyway, even if it's not changing what's in the formula now. But,
Oh, yeah, whatever they do is a decision, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting just to get that information, what the implications are. Which would be part of your report, I mentioned.
So we can leave it on here instead of discussion, maybe we just change it to an update for the next couple of months to see what happens.
Yeah, it'll probably kind of blend with the AST update that we get.
Okay.
Okay, well, then with that, I don't think there's any audience participation. BAC open discussion. I know Anna probably has an announcement.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the meeting started. So I am announcing that I am resigning from the BAC after this meeting ends. So I presumably have been elected to the Anchorage Assembly to represent West Anchorage. So similar to what Mr. Salt, who is a former BAC member last year, did, then it would be appropriate for me to step down because I can't serve on the advisory commission to myself. So, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this commission. I think I was appointed in December 2020, so I've been on for a little over 2 years. I think January 2021 was my first meeting, and I really appreciated the opportunity to learn so much and work with you all, and also members who have come and gone. And yeah, hopefully looking forward to working with you in a new capacity.
Awesome. Well, I definitely want to thank Anna for all of her service to this group, serving as chair and being a very engaged member, not being chair. So Anna put in a lot of effort, a lot of work, and did a great job with that. So I really appreciate your effort. And then I am one of your constituents now, so or will be when you get sworn in. So I'll gripe to you when I have gripes then.
Yeah, sounds good.
Aside. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I want to reiterate too, just thank you to Austin for all of your service and for really representing our district well and serving the whole city, both as assembly member and as mayor. So thank you again.
You're so welcome. I'm so excited for you to be my assembly member.
Then in that case, then our next scheduled meeting is May 11th. And I think our topics there, I mean, the discussion of real property. We did also have that item about electric vehicle impacts on fuel excise tax revenue. Is that something that Jack Kadamus would address as well? Or?
No, that would probably be Dan Moore in the treasurer's office. And that was something that Al had kind of brought up as we go towards that. And as part of the revised budget, you see that the fuel tax isn't really going down, so we're not seeing that, but we can definitely, if it's not something we want to have for May, we can always, keep that for a later date as well.
Okay, that might be a good one to defer to a later date.
And one way to look at that could be, because I know the buses have been switching to electric, right? So it'd be interesting. That would be one way to look within the fleet, look at a few years ago, how much fuel they're using versus now, because I know it's not zero, right? But that might be a way to just get a gauge of, for X number of new units in that fleet, it had this impact on fuel usage. And I know, again, it's not going to be like down to zero, but interesting. Just one little data point. And I don't know if the Uni owns other electric vehicles in their entire fleet besides the buses.
We do have, I believe, some hybrid vehicles, but I don't think that we are transitioning to all electric in specific, overarching areas. Our fleet manager definitely would be somebody to have that conversation with. He's very educated on the types of vehicles that work in cold weather and those kind of things, and what they look at when they're going out to review the purchases and what would be a good fit for our fleet. So we could wrap that into a conversation, maybe where it's not just about fuel excise tax, but more just more of a general conversation about maybe fleet and, transitioning to electric vehicles, how many we have, what do they look at, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Good, then I think we are, done. I think we're all out of business and we
Yeah.
don't need to formally adjourn, but thanks, everybody. Good discussion. Enjoy the rest of your day.